Hello to everyone. So I'm happy to be here in Vienna and introduce this lecture. Just to tell everyone, we're having around 30 people online currently. I guess they'll be joining gradually as well. So dear Ifac affiliates, dear colleagues, dear Ifac guests, it is a pleasure to have you gathered today for this Ifac lecture. This lecture is a long-standing tradition of Ifac. It is traditionally held in person in spring in conjunction to an Ifac officers meeting in Luxembourg, Austria, where the Ifac Secretariat is located. And this meeting will indeed take place tomorrow. But due to the pandemic situation, the last lecture took place in a fully virtual format and was given by Dongil Cho, the Ifac president-elect. This experience motivated us to hold this year's lecture in a hybrid format with part of the audience connected online, hello to everybody, and part of the audience here in the Haus der Ingenieur in Vienna. It is a pleasure to combine both the physical presence of colleagues and so many of you from many countries. Among today's audience, I would like in particular to acknowledge the presence of Professor Kurtschlacher, the former Ifac secretary who served Ifac at that position for 15 years before myself and chaired as many of these Ifac lectures. Thank you, Kurt. I would like also to thank all the good friends attending here and online. I won't make the whole list of that. Just many thanks to them. I'll keep it short. And I'll give the floor to Professor Hajime Azama, Ifac president, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but has recorded an address especially for you. So please, could you send the video? Here it goes.
Hello, everyone. I am Hajime Azama, president of Ifac, International Federation of Automatic Control for 2020 to 2023, and I am speaking to you today from Tokyo, Japan. I had hoped to be in Vienna today, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic situation, this was unfortunately not possible, and so I have recorded this message for you. Whether you are in person in Vienna or attending online from elsewhere, a big thank you to all of you for joining us for today's Ifac technical lecture presented by Professor Sarah Spurgeon from the United Kingdom. The permanent Ifac Secretariat has been located in Luxembourg, Austria since 1978 by invitation of the Austrian federal government. I'm very grateful for the association support subsidy, which is provided through the BMK Ministry of Austria. This spring technical lecture here in Austria, the home country of the permanent Ifac Secretariat, is an annual tradition, shortly paused due to the pandemic, and we are happy that you can be here and be a part of its return. You are probably already familiar with Ifac, but I'd like to introduce Ifac briefly. For more than 60 years, Ifac has made various professional technical activities from theory and technology to applications and the societal challenge related to automatic control. Ifac has provided diverse people with various services and opportunities to participate in various conferences, more than 40 each year in years when there is no big Ifac World Congress, to be members of technical committees in many areas of scientific interest, and to present and publish papers and so on. You can find out more about Ifac by visiting our website. Ifac's official members are national member organizations which represent countries. If you would like to learn more about Ifac and become active in our community, you can sign up to become an Ifac affiliate. Becoming an affiliate is free and allows you to access all of the benefits that Ifac can provide to individuals interested in control engineering. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy today's lecture.
Thank you, Hajime. So today, as Ifac Secretary, I have the honor to welcome Professor Sarah Spurgeon for her lecture. Professor Sarah Spurgeon graduated from the University of York in the UK, where she obtained her PhD in 1988. She then held academic positions at the University of Loughborough and then at University of Leicester, where she was appointed as professor in 2002 and was head of their Department of Engineering from 2006 till 2008. She then joined the University of Kent, where she was Professor of Control Engineering and head of the School of the Engineering and Digital Arts until 2016. Since then, she is Professor of Control Engineering and head of the Department of Electronic and Electrical Engineering at the University College London. Sarah's research interests are in the area of systems modeling and analysis, robust control and estimation, in which areas she has published over 270 refereed research papers. In her field, she has chaired the IEEE Technical Committee on Variable Structure and Sliding Mode Control, topics that are directly related to today's lecture. Her scientific achievements were recognized by an IEEE Millennium Medal in 2000, by the Honeywell International Medal for Distinguished Contribution as a Control and Measurement Technologist to Developing the Theory of Control, that was in 2010,
or also as IEEE Distinguished Lecturer for the Control Systems Society for the period 2011-2014. In addition to these scientific activities, Sarah is dedicated to serve professional society. To cite just a few, within the UK, she is currently the Vice President of the IET and is past President of the Engineering Professor Council, the representative body for engineering higher education. At an international level, she is currently member of the General Assembly of the European Control Association. She is elected member of the Board of Governors of the IEEE Control Systems Society. And most important for us today, she's Vice President for Publications for Ifac. So congratulations, Sarah, for all these achievements. You will now share some of your results and thoughts with your talk entitled Making the Case for Switch Control in System Science. As Sarah is arriving, just for those who are online, you can ask for questions in the chat. I will rephrase these orally and we can discuss at the end of the presentation. Of course, keep your mics silent, but should be no problem. So please, Sarah.
Well, welcome everyone. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here today presenting this Ifac lecture. It's also very special, I think, as we go back to a hybrid format. We have colleagues in the room who I haven't seen for several years as we come out of this COVID pandemic. So I'm going to I feel rusty. I haven't given a lecture like this for over 2 years in person. So I'm going to try my best this afternoon to give you some of the excitement that I feel for my discipline. Now, in terms of the presentation, I'm going to start by talking about the discontinuous control paradigm. Those that know me will know that this is really what I've spent a 30-year career exploring. And it's true to say that today I'm just as excited by everything this has to offer as I ever was. And I'm hoping by the end of this lecture, I will have passed on some of that excitement to you. I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at some recent results on decentralized control. And for that, I'm referring to a rather nice figure from Francesca Boehm, who's one of my colleagues at UCL, where the paradigm here is we have lots of things, and it doesn't matter what those things are, but we have lots of things that are connected. Compared to the start of my career, we have systems where no longer are we interested in control of the subsystem or indeed of the system itself. We're actually interested in control of larger system of systems. And it's my opinion that these will only grow. So for the next generation of control engineers and system specialists, problems will undoubtedly get bigger. They will involve a whole range of diverse things, not just engineering things. They will involve people, they will involve data. And there is a huge question as to how we manage control of such processes, how we make sure that we don't pass all the data, how we can be clear what's happening at the nodes, for example, circled in red there, which may be at the edges of our system. How do we check in and make sure they're okay when we clearly don't want to know what everything is doing all the time and how everything interacts to everything else? This moves me on to the third topic I'm going to touch upon, which is something I feel quite passionately about, which concerns big data and the learning revolution that we see ourselves as part of. And I think it's something that's important for control engineers to consider, to think where we fit and what we could do, and indeed what may be best for societal problems. And I want to give you one. I'm not going to have answers on that, and really I don't think there are answers. I think there is a lot of debate, but I'm going to give you some of my views. And then I'm going to conclude with a few remarks. So to start, I'm going to talk and introduce to you variable structure control. Now, this was a topic that came about from work in the former Soviet Union, where people who were very good at mathematics, analytically, interested in differential equations with discontinuous right-hand sides, together with engineers who were very interested in robustly controlling electrical machines and drives, for example, made very useful observations, both in theory and practice, about the value of opening up the class of systems we consider so that rather than having a fixed control, we allow the structure of that control to change. And from that work in 1977, a survey paper was published in English, which caused the discipline to become much more widely known and explored, and it's gone from strength to strength from that time onwards. So let's just think of a simple system, a double integrator, with a simple feedback control law. If we choose k between 0 and 1, we get the phase portrait on the left-hand side, a sort of fat, elongated ellipse, not desirable trajectory. Certainly, we don't see any motion from wherever we start that goes in towards the origin. If we let the gain get larger than 1, then we get a tall ellipse from wherever we start. Again, really not very desirable by itself. However, if we take those two control laws, we have k in some quadrants that's less than 1, and k in subquadrants that's greater than 1, we can form a system which is asymptotically stable. So effectively, we make sure that in those quadrants labeled B, we take my elongated fat ellipse and we take that trajectory, which moves us closer to the origin as we move around. The problem becomes if we stay on that trajectory, we then move further away from the origin. but not if we switch to the tall ellipse. If we switch to the tall ellipse at that point, then that continues to take us closer to the origin. So we get this very nice asymptotically stable behavior for the price of a switch. So with a variable structure control, what we have is a control law that we change according to some defined rules, which can, as we will see in some of the examples I talk about, can be very, very different. And we have this nice potential to develop new properties which weren't inherent in any of the original subsystems, and they can appear. But actually, a variable structure control can give us a lot more than this. And I think this is the thing that has always excited me the most about variable structure control. When I talk to my students, I talk about the magic of discontinuous feedback control. Let's think for a minute the same double integrator we had before and consider that that is our nominal plant. Let's then say we have some sort of a perturbed plant, which in this case I'll take to be a scaled pendulum. So it's the nominal double integrator with some uncertainty that's written in red. If I design a very particular type of discontinuous feedback control, so I design a switching function, which we can think of very, very simply as the desired dynamics I want my system to have. So in this case, my switching function, when s equals 0, gives me a first order system with a pole at -1. So I'm saying that that's the behavior I'd like my double integrator to have. Clearly, there is a very broad class of desirable behaviors I could pick, but this is what I've picked in this particular case. And I've chosen a controller which is just a switch. If rho is sufficiently large in my switch, then both my nominal plant and my perturbed plant, their evolution can be seen on the phase portrait in the middle. And what we see is an initial transient that's different. And that's always going to be the case. So before I hit that line, which is effectively my line y dot plus y equals 0, I'm lying on my switching function. Before I hit that line, different things may happen to me. But as soon as I hit that line, both plants exhibit exactly the same behavior. No way have I told the control law anything about the sign yt. So it isn't that it knew the disturbance and I cancelled it out. I'm not minimizing some norm on the impact of the disturbance. The disturbance and its effect has effectively gone away. And that is really strong property. That is a complete invariance to the impact of that perturbation. So what I have when I'm designing these discontinuous control strategies, typically, I have a two-stage behavior that's really quite different to a classical control problem. Normally, the controller gives us the performance. With this kind of control, the control doesn't give us the performance. The switching function gives us the performance. In this case, it was a system with the pole at -1, nothing to do with the controller. The controller then seeks only to ensure that the performance I've specified is reachable. And in this case, I designed my controller so that S and its derivative had opposite signs, because that is enough to make sure that I lie on my switching function. Now, when I was a PhD student and first becoming excited about some of this, I had a really hard time. In the UK, lots of people were interested in H-infinity, robust control. They were minimizing norms. nobody was very positive at all about this idea that you could actually nullify the impact of a disturbance without knowing what it was. So it's really important to understand why this happens, because this rather subtle difference between how we do control and what the control does is really what opens up the robustness. It gives us this whole potential to consider large-scale systems without knowing lots of information about them. It gives us lots of potential to find out what's happening with systems, for example, in terms of monitoring and failure detection. So what effectively happens when I apply that discontinuous controller? Well, effectively what happens is I'm applying a signal which is switching around. In theory, it's switching with infinite frequency, which clearly, on the other hand, gives us other problems. But if we filter that signal, what we see effectively happens is that discontinuous signal, on average, is effectively reconstructing my sine term. So if we look at the filtered signal, which is the blue plot, we can see that it's pretty well following the uncertainty, the difference between that nominal model and the perturbed model. So without knowing about it, this principle of the equivalent injection, this using discontinuity, gives us a means to find out a lot of additional information. One of the things that's interested me in very recent times has been this switch control paradigm and its relationship to nature. When I started my career, I was there with the power electronics people, I was there with the robotics people, I was there with engineering systems. But when we see this robustness, we think that, well, perhaps there must be more to it. And a very good example of showing you how nature uses switch control is with something that's been incredibly topical in this coronavirus period, which is the immune system. Our immune system is a wonderful piece of engineering. For many of us, if we are subject to some kind of applied viral load, as we see on my figure, that's the kind of mountain, that's a virus load that's been applied to the system, then the immune system, a good healthy immune system, will respond to that viral load and bring us back to a healthy state. And that plot on the right-hand side is actually experimental data. So it's showing the time evolution of the population dynamics of a specific type of cell following vigorous infection. And the first thing I think when we think about these control systems, because effectively it's a natural control system within the immune system, there is a feedback control. And I think it's interesting for us to learn from these ourselves. The first thing we note is that the control system actually is highly conserved. It doesn't immediately act. It doesn't say, gosh, there's something here, I need to respond. It's evolved through nature to be conserved, to wait and see. Does it really need to react? Clearly, we come into contact with viruses all the time. It wouldn't be good if our immune system was responding aggressively every time it saw a virus. So we see that initial period where it actually, where something's ramping up, but it doesn't actually do anything. It then goes full throttle, okay, and says, right, I've really got to do something here, before turning back, and we'll see effectively switching to do something different and to return us back to that nice healthy state. Now, on the left-hand side of my slide here is a model of the immune system. It's not my model, it's actually from a paper on immunology. And this very simple second-order model of the immune system looks at populations of activated T cells and memory cells, and it uses a switch. So F of T is effectively a switch. And it's a really simple undergraduate exercise to see what happens with the immune system. Effectively, that initial burst, when we finally decide to do something, is an unstable dynamics. So it has like an unstable dynamic trajectory because it wants to respond really, really quickly, having decided that something needs to be done in response to the virus. So rather like the aircraft pilot in a combat situation, wanting to move rapidly, it wants to move as quickly as it can, and so it opens up with an unstable trajectory before switching to a more benign, stable behavior to bring back the dynamics into this so-called contraction and memory phase. So a very important system to us that is a discontinuous control system. If you look at that, it isn't that dynamics is a really poor response. So the graphs on the left-hand side there are just to show you. The bottom one is the graph from the first slide in this subsection. So that's the experimental results. The graph at the top is actually a Simulink simulation of that second order system. We can see that it's pretty good. So the output dynamics of this rather simple switch control strategy are really quite well aligned to experimental data. So I began to ask myself, can control engineering provide insights into failure cases? Even more so, can control engineering provide insights that might be useful to clinicians in terms of treatment? And so one of the things I've done some, I've had some wonderful opportunities working with interdisciplinary teams across this space, because clearly I, as a control engineer, I need an immunologist. I need a clinician in order to look at these kind of problems and truly appreciate them. So the benefits of cross-disciplinary working become really exciting for us. And the answer is we can do things. And I've worked in a number of areas with this kind of work. I'm just going to present one very, very briefly, which is one of the more recent ones, which was working with a clinician actually at UCL, and a team in Australia, of modelers in Australia, where we were trying to understand elite control of HIV. Now, what's elite control? They refer to elite controllers, which, perhaps clinically they refer to elite controllers. And this relates to the quite small number of individuals who can actually contract HIV, but whose immune system suppresses it naturally. So they have a natural response within their immune system which suppresses the HIV loads to undetectable levels without treatment, whereas clearly the vast majority of individuals who can contract HIV are going to have potentially a lifetime of antiretroviral therapy, for example. So it's interesting to say, well, what really happens with these individuals who have this very special immune system that lets them control HIV themselves without the antiretroviral therapy? So effectively what we need is a mathematical model, which we had. nothing whatsoever to do with me. That was from biological links to other teams. We then look at a sliding surface, and we can look at a range of them. This is the interesting thing. And I think this shows why evolution, and why I become more and more committed to evolution as a wonderful thing. Mathematically, you can choose a range of sliding surfaces, and you look at this particular problem with all its nonlinearity. And many of the conclusions are quite consistent. So effectively, I've given one here. So in this case, we just look at something very simple that says, first order, we want the viral loads to decay. And we use this notion of the sliding mode reachability condition together with consideration of parameter variations. One thing you do find when you work with these models biologically is the range of parameter variations, whether it's a model for humans or for this, which was an experimental trial, an animal experimental trial, the parameter variations are quite vast. So, you know, they can be relatively coarsely defined, but certainly broad. So the problem for me and my collaborators was to explore effectively what these elite controllers were doing in this model of the elite control process. And we did a lot of testing via simulation and analysis, looking at the equivalent control, which lets us understand what is a highly nonlinear and time-varying control, and we can look at what the body is doing over time by this approach to understand how these immune systems are different. And we've also used this kind of idea with certain drug treatments. There are certain drug treatments. Another example is psoriasis, which is a skin complaint, which can be very, life-changing for those individuals that have it. There is a class of drug treatments for individuals who suffer with that complaint, which can be life-changing. It can effectively eradicate the psoriasis symptoms. So not like applying creams to minimize impacts, literally like my double integrator with the perturbation, it can eradicate the symptoms. But for other individuals, presenting with exactly the same history, exactly the same symptoms, given exactly the same drug treatment, the immune system doesn't respond well at all. So this is another example of how we can use these ideas to explore what's happening with either existing control systems that appear in the biology or a drug treatment, which is effectively, and in my mind, an additional feedback loop. I'm now going to move on to talk about some engineering work, and in this whole presentation, I'm not going to put together much mathematics at all, but I'm going to refer to one or two things because I know that we may have some students listening for which mathematics was their thing. Certainly was always my thing. It's how I got into this in the first place, how we could use mathematics for good, you know, how we could analyze problems and make a difference. And mathematics and the mathematics underpinning control, particularly discontinuous control in my case, lets us do that. So in this case, one of my big motivations has been scaling up. How can we manage complexity? You know, when you look at energy problems these days, They might be involving consumers, they might be involving markets, they might be involved, yes, they're still involving the core engineering there, but it's a much broader problem than it ever was. There's definitely a need to consider communications, and as we'll see in this second part of my talk, you know, I think data's good. I think I was always kind of reticent when people thought, well, more data we have, the better we can do as control engineers, the better we can do as society. Personally, I think data needs to be managed, and you know, some data can be good and very good, but some data can actually not be so necessary and give us problems. And we see a greater motivation from that these days when we're also considering energy requirements, because clearly the data centers that are passing around large amounts of data are huge energy consumers in an environment where we're trying to be increasingly energy efficient. So we need to balance this, having all this information, with actually what might be the best information to have, what might be the minimal subset of information to have that actually lets us be really robust. So some of the work that I've done over the years, and which I continue to do, looks at nonlinear interconnected systems where we look at uncertainty. And that might be uncertainty in the systems themselves, but it might be also uncertainty in how they interconnect. And really below all the mathematics, so if you peel away the mathematics in much of that, it's actually using this principle of the equivalent injection. It's actually saying, well, if we use some discontinuous control, as our highly complex bodies use some discontinuous control, then we can actually get some very good things that happen in a very unsophisticated way. So we saw with that model of the immune system, when we think of what it does and the fact that you can model it in these very relatively simple ways, and yet get extremely high levels of robustness. You know, I think, well, I hope you'll agree with me that the gain we get for a discontinuity in some of these problems is really worth the pain in terms of, well, discontinuity, probably we'd rather do without it if we could. So in this particular work that we did, we're looking at decentralized control. So, you know, very much pushed by my kind of feelings that, you know, we don't want to know about everything. This isn't a good approach. But yes, a lot of the time we're interested in something, tracking something well, but also we're actually interested in the whole system too. So we're not just interested in, yes, we look at these outputs and they track well. We really want to make sure that the whole system is in a good space too. So we want bounded state behavior. So here I've got some a system description. I'm not going to talk much, well, at all really about the detail, but I'm going to highlight a couple of things. So we have an array of n subsystems, which are somehow interconnected. And as a control engineer, and particularly as a discontinuous control engineer, I tend to think of my uncertainty in two broad lumps. So I think of uncertainty, which is implicit in the input channel, which for me is never going to be a problem, because with an appropriate discontinuous control law, assuming I have sufficient gain, I can nullify that. And then other lumps, which are not implicit in the input channel, and can be wider. And in this particular case, they're representing unknown interconnection. So this is where, so I've got a system here which is nonlinear. It's got some uncertainty of its own, which I'm assuming is matched, so it's implicit in the input channel. And I'm saying, well, I can have a broader class of uncertainty, which is going to represent how these subsystems are impacted by the rest of the larger system. And fundamentally, I'm wanting to take some sort of output and have a decentralized control, which will make the output of my system track this ideal output, and that makes sure that everything is bounded in this particular case. So I have to have some assumptions on this particular system, and on this in this particular case, and as is frequently the case, I'm interested in channels. I'm interested in channels, as I've said, where the input acts, which is the first triple there. So GI effectively where the input acts into my system. And then I've got the interconnections, which act through, if you like, through a channel PI. So I effectively have two triples there that I'm interested in. And I'm always going to be interested in how this channel where the control acts relates to the channel where the output is, relates to the channel where my wider uncertainty comes in. And I have some statements on uniform relative degree. I think probably the easiest way for some individuals listening, I'm sure they won't want to go that far, but I didn't want to not put my assumption up and then get some tricky questions afterwards. But the easiest way to unpick this is that if my uniform relative degree RIA is equal to n, then I have a feedback linearizable system. So effectively here, this is looking at the distributions of those two function matrices, which represent where my input is and where my interactions are. And it lets me write the system in a particular way. And the first thing you note with the first subsystem is that you see there that I have a whole load of things coming into that first subsystem where I have a nice input, which I can nullify those things. So with an appropriate discontinuous control law VI, then I'm going to be able to manage all of that relatively straightforwardly. I have a second assumption, not too strict, that my output signals and their derivatives up to this order of my uniform relative degree are smooth, known and bounded. And then I define a sliding function, which is very much the big brother, if you like, of the first order sliding function I used in my first example, where I had the double integrator and I had my dynamics, which were just the first order system with the pole at -1. Here I have a system where I've chosen effectively a stable dynamics as my switching function. And this I would quite often do. As we've seen, people who are involved in discontinuous control don't always have every subsystem that is stable. And we've seen that even in ourselves, there are systems which aren't always stable within certain parts of their evolution. But as control engineers, quite often, and given this is a tracking error, we definitely want that tracking error to go to 0. So for that first problem, which is all about how I get the performance, which is called the existence problem, how I choose the switching function, why it's a good idea. Well, in this particular case, when the system moves on that sliding surface for each of the subsystems, then indeed I can show quite easily that my output tracking errors go to 0, identically 0, and that my states, the remainder states, if you like, are bounded. Perhaps what's more interesting is that this reachability problem, how I pick the control, is really quite simple. It's a big switch, actually, and some compensating effects. So I tailor the switch, being a control engineer that's designed a lot of controllers. I tailor the magnitude of my switch so that I'm not using too much control activity, too much unnecessary control activity. And I have a bit of feed forward, and that's it. So a very simple controller, relatively. And in this particular case, so long as if my switch is big enough, if you like, then my interconnected system goes to the sliding surface and I get my perfect tracking in finite time. Now, like all good control engineers, when this was published, and this is probably one of the big criticisms of quite a lot of our community, I did a very small example. So I had two inverted pendulums connected by a spring, because it is a nonlinear system. It does have nonlinear interconnections. And you can see from the time responses of the system outputs that it very nicely tracks the reference. Further, all my states are nicely bounded. So I'm now going to move away from the mathematics. I'm never sure whether to do some mathematics or not, but I always find it difficult not to do any at all. So I apologise for those who'd wished I hadn't, and those that perhaps know a lot about mathematics and said, well, she didn't do enough. But I think I have been about mathematics, so it's important to show that I still have some mathematics there. Now I'm going to move on from my small problem and start thinking about bigger problems and think about this increasingly data-focused world of ours. And this is very much a personal view. So this is what Sarah Spurgeon thinks at this moment in time. So for a lot of us who've worked in the control community, we've worked with physical models. We've done a lot on model-based control. We know that models may be very time-consuming to find. They can be expensive to find. For some, we have them. So you look at the aircraft industry, for example, they have wonderful models that they've developed over many years. Those of us that have seen the automotive industry very much catch up with the aerospace industry. So some areas we have lots of stuff, and we have lots of stuff we know about really, really well. But we perhaps don't have the models of everything. So we have some which we know, which is validated, which is established, and that probably, I would argue, we don't want to just throw away. You know, we've got a lot of knowledge there, we know what we're doing. But is a world which just thinks about physical models so scalable? On the other hand, we've got a 21st century that's really geared up for data and intelligence. So we have all this information. For me, there is a big question about this data. It is definitely a hot topic. It's definitely all there. But there is still always a worry about robustness. I think we only have to see, those of us that mark student reports, you can get student reports, you can put it into trackers which track for plagiarism. And if students have included a lot of data in their report, that data will be found. Certainly in the UK, you put your students' reports in, the Met Office, it will come back with a chunk with files where it says, this data already appears in these files, even though it's absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the topic that the student has been working on. So there is a big question in my mind about data and robustness and how we can try and include some of the structure that we know about, that we've learned about, that's there in the community. So I suppose from my perspective, I think we've got to start to think about putting this all together. So how we take this world of data AI, how we take our world of physical models and how we bring them together so that we can really manage uncertainty in an incredibly positive way. And personally, I think that's necessary if we're ever going to manage uncertainty properly and with high degree of confidence of what is going to happen. There's clearly a lot of interest in items, elements such as trust of such systems. So how the average human being in the street going to be able to trust these data and AI type systems? Well, if they're going to trust them, we have to be able to demonstrate to them that we can manage uncertainty really well. Because I don't believe we'll ever get to, and having come through this coronavirus pandemic, I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we have a completely known world where nothing unsurprising happens. Things happen that none of us ever expected, as COVID showed many of us. Now, as I'm here giving an Ifac lecture, I wanted to bring into the discussion at this time the excellent article that was written in Annual Reviews in Control. It was entitled Systems and Control for the Future of Humanity, Research Agenda, Current and Future Roles, Impact and Grand Challenges. And it was written in 2017, so you may think, it's a little bit old, but actually it was taking quite a long-term view, at least out to 2030. And this roadmap defined for us data-driven modelling, machine learning and control as one of the 7 key research and innovation challenges for control. It talked about the need for learning abilities and the means to maintain verifiable high performance through active actuation and control. And these are really important goals, and I think they're really important goals for us to crack. Now, as someone who's interested, as we said, in discontinuous control, I started to have a look at the sort of intersection between discontinuous control and some of these data-driven approaches. And certainly within my own community, there's a common starting point in some of the contributions, which basically says we think of a nonlinear system as being where the output of that system can be generated by looking at some relationship between a series of inputs and series of previous outputs of that particular system. We don't know the function, we don't know the size of any of the vectors, but we can broadly think that, well, if we know about the inputs and outputs, then it's perhaps it's potentially not too strict a step to say that this may be a good starting point. And then we can take some conditions, which again are not too strict, whereby we can look at how if you like, the output at the point we're interested in can be given by the output at a preceding point, and some function which is changing, it's bounded, but is multiplying the inputs. And we can look at how we can estimate that function by minimizing an appropriate cost function. So being able to sort of, if you like, do this data-driven modeling in this very particular way has been a starting point. Now, a recent paper in the International Journal of Control started to think about doing some sliding, applying some of the sliding ideas I've talked about in this particular framework. So it defined a sliding function. It defined a cost function, And I think although the cost function looks a little bit strange, perhaps it's not so strange if we just step back from it a little bit for a moment. Effectively, with that particular cost function, what it is effectively saying is that if we're far away from the origin, we really want to converge very rapidly to our sliding function. So, you know, we allow our control to be more powerful. So that initial transient where we had our double integrator, the one nominal without the sinusoid, the one with the sinusoid, we saw that initial transient that was different, where I may be subject to different types of uncertainty. We really minimize the time that happens. And then when we're close to the S where we want to be, we actually tone down the control. So, you know, we don't do things that are too aggressive, and this doesn't give us problems with large discontinuity in the control. So although it looks heavy, that's effectively is what it's doing. It's tuning things so that we have this very big control action that forces us towards S, and that that allows us to have a larger activity then, but then tunes it down and becomes a much more appropriate control action as S becomes smaller. And you can find an optimal controller. I think one of the things you note straight away, and certainly when you try and do this, one of the things I found, there are quite a lot of parameters that you need to define, and it's not intuitive at this moment in time, at least to me, how you'd select all these parameters and what they're actually doing for you. So some it's okay, and you can see that, but others it's less obvious. So from that, that's it. So what they did in this paper was they tried to do exactly what I've done in a lot of my work. They effectively tried to imply within this data-driven learning, this model-free approach, they tried to use a reachability condition. So they tried to impose some of the ideas of variable structure and sliding mode control into this framework. And they did a couple of things. One is they made some assumptions on the disturbance, which allows them to bound it quite nicely and also allows them to estimate that disturbance. And that's something that, going back a very long time, a very well-cited paper in sliding mode and variable structure control used that kind of disturbance estimation. So they're using something from history in this data-driven modeling field. And then they used a control law, which again looks a bit heavy, but if you look at the detail, the first elements in the control law are really just the optimal control law, removing the disturbance. So they're removing the impact of the disturbance, and they're keeping that nominal control there, and then they're putting a switch in there. So fundamentally, and we see there, in terms of the size of that switch, that's the phenomena that I was talking about earlier in terms of how we tailor the size of the discontinuity depending on where we are in our evolution, whether we're somewhere that's a long way away from the sliding surface and we want to get there really quickly, or we're there and we want something a little bit more nuanced. Now, one of the really interesting things about this for me is it was using some things from that we know from sliding mode control, but it was using it in a data-driven way to make sure that the system entered this quasi-sliding mode and stayed there. It made sure that the tracking error was bounded. So not the exact tracking to zero as I had with my, my previous controller, but it has a bounded tracking error. And it deployed a reaching condition, which rather interestingly collapses to a very famous reaching law due to Professor Gao, who's a member at the moment of our Ifac Council. He has a very famous paper. Lots of people use his reaching law. Well, this reaching law, or if you like, this policy for reinforcement learning, effectively, collapsed down with so if we bunch some of these parameters in particular ways, it's the Gao reaching law. So having seen the parallels, it's interesting to see what happens. So I had a simple play of looking at a nonlinear system with a reference signal. I've got no uncertainty there. It's not perfect. You could probably do better. As I said, there's lots of parameters to pick. I played around a bit, but I didn't spend a huge amount of time picking the parameters. I looked what happened when I applied some sort of step disturbance. And so I'm not doing the sinusoid track. I'm not tracking the sinusoid. I've done a step input to the system, and then I've applied a step disturbance to the system. You look with the disturbance compensation, without the disturbance compensation, there's not a lot of difference, except when we see what's happening with the parameter estimate, you see that effectively, if you don't estimate the disturbance, then it comes through on the parameter. So the estimated parameter lumps everything together and is different, whether we have disturbance compensation or not, because effectively, if we don't do the disturbance compensation at all, then anything that's a disturbance, the whole methodology pushes it into some uncertainty in the system. So I continue to dabble, if you like, with some of these ideas about data-driven methods. And in my conclusions, I've got no results for this, but it's a PhD student that I have the absolute pleasure to co-supervise, Keshav Iyengar, who I work with, a colleague, Dan Stoyanov, who leads our Center for Interventional and Surgical Sciences at UCL. And they're interested in all kinds of primarily robotic systems that can be used clinically. And this concentric tube robot is quite an interesting one. It's used for minimally invasive surgery. It's very dexterous, compliant, made of super elastic type materials. The tube interactions are extremely challenging. It is a system where people have tried to do the classical robotics approach. And it does look, in this particular case, as if the classical robotics of doing the modeling yields some good things, but is far from perfect. Keshav has been applying a deep reinforcement learning approach, which seems to be showing some benefits and getting some good results, where we look across a range of geometries and a range of conditions, if you like. Fundamentally, what he does for a larger challenge is you can make your concentric tube robot with different numbers of concentric tubes. And he can show that with the same data-driven control law, he can get good tracking accuracy of that particular system. The really exciting part that he's trying to do now is to take it into experimental trials on a rig, I hasten to add, not in a human being. And this is really exciting. So I don't want to give you the impression that I'm in any way down on data-driven type methods. I'm in there, and I hopefully will get some very good results from these particular set of trials. It certainly has potential, and it is one where, despite all the work that's gone in control and robotics, that it looks like classical approaches to robotics for this particular system are challenging to progress to anything like the accuracy that would be necessary in order to contemplate trying this as, for example, a steerable needle for a human being. So what I'm going to do now is my final conclusions. As I said at the start, discontinuous control systems for me are just as exciting as they were when I was 21 years of age, a long time ago now, and I first saw those early papers on variable structure and sliding mode control. I think the robustness properties they exhibit are extremely relevant to the grand challenges in control. I think we see in the biology more motivation. You know, to me, I think there is so much we have to learn from the control systems that are inherent in nature, and in turn we can give back by helping clinical academics to understand drug treatments as a control engineer. I've spent some time in recent years with clinicians, more than I have previously, and finding a common language is sometimes, it takes time. But the ultimate conclusion of most clinicians when you talk to them about drug treatments is they're highly conservative, high-gain controls. They are nowhere near the particular drug treatment that an individual would need. They are chosen to cover a broad church of individuals around the world. So they are high-gain controllers, typically more than we need in order to do this. So there is clearly stuff that we can give back toward moving towards personalized medicine. I also think there's more we can do to use the robustness of the paradigm in data-driven and learning systems. It must be said at the moment, Keshav with the concentric tube robot is using a range of policies and is showing that the learning policies he is using in his deep reinforcement learning make a big difference, as we as control engineers, I'm sure, would expect. We're not using discontinuity yet, but I think there is certainly work that we can do in that area. And so with that, I'd like to stop and thank you all very much for listening to me this afternoon. Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you, Sarah. So we have some time for questions. I'll start maybe with people in the room if you wish. Or, yeah, Frank, here.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for this very inspiring talk. As you know, I'm an optimal control person.
Yep.
You say the biggest advantages of variable structure control, or the key features, are switching and the resulting robustness, right? But this is exactly what optimal control people also say.
Yep.
From optimal control, we also get the switching. Mm-hmm. And from optimal control, also we have the inherent robustness. So agreeing fully with you that variable structure control is very nice, but isn't there even something more that must be present that makes it such a great method?
Yes, I mean, I'm not someone who, I think the difference for me with optimal control is that in optimal control, the paradigm, unless I'm wrong, but a lot of the time, it's the actual controller that's prescribing the performance directly. And in our case, that isn't typically what we're doing. Okay, so we will often use an optimal control to provide our performance and see the discontinuity as enhancing the robustness. And indeed, there are some very old results now that show that you can do that kind of thing. But I'm certainly not against optimal control. You know, I'm a great believer in diversity in all its forms, as I know you are too, Frank. And I certainly don't believe there is a one-size-fits-all approach to control. And I think the more creative we can be to blend different things together and understand and develop our understanding as a result of that, rather than sit in silos saying, you know, I'm an individual that does this and they're an individual that does that. And I think that's what you're saying, and I would agree with you. But there are some people that are very anti-discontinuous control, you know, that really think it's not a positive thing. And so I suppose my message is for those where clearly you're a convert, as you see the value of discontinuous control anyway. The interesting thing about some of these other discontinuous controls, and it must be said, I don't claim to have looked at all of them, but some when I have looked where people have said, we work in this, it's not sliding mode control, or it's not variable structure control, but it's a discontinuous control. You can quite often map the problems so that they look, you know, you can phrase the one as a problem in the other domain.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'll read a little bit what we have in the chat. We mainly have very good comments saying that was a wonderful talk, and I do agree with that a lot. And then we have a couple of precise questions. So we had one by Vignesh Ramakrishnan, who was commenting at the start about sliding mode control and variable structure control, and he said, can that be called event-triggered intermittent feedback control? Is there a link there?
I'm sure that because event-triggered, you know, effectively, certainly as a variable structure control, you know, when I read papers that are event-triggered papers, I can read those papers and see them as a type of because variable structure control, in a sense, is extremely loose. It's just saying, as Frank rightly said, with optimal, it is something that has a switched control, and many places do that, and event-triggered control is one of them. So I think the question is completely correct.
Right. Then we had another question by Thiago Oliveira. More about the drug treatment part, and he was asking, how do we impose the sliding dynamics as a sliding mode elite for the HIV model without drug treatments?
No, well, effectively what we're doing in that particular case is we're not designing a control. So, you know, in the elite controllers, so these are individuals, or in this case is an animal population that exhibit elite control. So effectively have an immune system that can cause the viral load to be reduced to an incredibly low level. So effectively what we're doing is we're using it as a synthesis problem to analyze how it does that. So we know it reduces it. So we effectively say, well, what is the equivalent control needed to do that? So we're not imposing a control. That is the immune system that itself is imposing a control. Okay, so that's a different one to the drug treatment, where in the drug treatment case, clearly the drug treatment is the control. And it's nuanced. So, you know, we are saying that within the immune system, there is a feedback control. In fact, there are a number of, you know, there's all kinds of feedback controls going on there. And we're using the principle of the equivalent injection to unpick what's going on. Does that answer the question?
Right, sure. Then I will just add as well a question related to that, because I have some colleagues working with clinicists close to me, and they're working in anesthesia. So anesthesia
Yes.
is also a control problem.
Yep.
And at the difference of what you said, they're not doing high gain or not
No.
too high gain, because then you
No.
kill the person.
Exactly.
And so it sort of also a reaction to what you said, because you said usually you would do high gain control when you're far from the equilibrium, from where you want to go, but then you will saturate.
Yeah.
What about the saturations there?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is definitely the case. So, you know, because we have a discontinuous element, we have a band anyway in terms of saturation. So saturation tends to be less of a problem for us because we can limit the size of the control. So, but I agree, you know, if you haven't got the ability to inject enough gain in so you can have a big enough switch, you will take a long time to reach the sliding mode, and there's nothing you can do about it. You know, that must go, because, you know, the energy available is insufficient. But if energy is there, then clearly to make sure you reach it as quickly as possible is a good thing to do, because this is when all the robustness kicks in, when you effectively can recover these signals that come from the discontinuity, these equivalent injection signals, and use them positively to tailor your dynamics.
Great, thanks. Some other questions from the room here? Yeah, sure, Kurt.
I also want to thank for this very interesting talk and the very interesting topics. I have more, I think, a very simple question. If I look at switching control, in the time continuous case, I get an invariant manifold.
Mm-hmm.
So if I reach the switching surface, I stay on it.
Yes.
What is the counterpart in the time discrete control? I can never stay on a manifold.
No, and that is true. Absolutely, you cannot stay. And you know, in that particular case, typically what happens is you try and stay within a boundary layer. Which in terms of most physical things, certainly when we look at the clinical things, that's not such a tricky thing, because, you know, most measurement devices in clinical settings have if you like, a calibration accurate, you know, I mean, in simulation, we can clearly get a number to a perfect amount, but many of the clinical things that I happen to have worked with anyway, and certainly within the, for example, the HIV case, you know, the number of cells you can detect, there is a definite limit on the number of cells. So it is effectively being within a boundary layer. And so long as you can stay within that boundary layer, is usually the goal. But it does cause theoreticians a lot of headaches, because they talk about things being non-ideal. But of course, to me, because I've always wanted to do this to try and have a positive impact in the real world is non-ideal. So as we say, we have non-ideal measurements, you know, we have a sensor accuracy, you know, so to me, it's not a huge worry that something can't be identically zero in real life, because it won't be anyway, I suppose would be why I think it's still a worthwhile thing to do, while acknowledging you're absolutely correct.
Thank you, Sarah. I have another question here in the chat. Comes from Emilia Friedman. And the question, well, first, congratulations, of course. And second, what about delays? Have you considered delays?
Emilia is my great friend. Emilia knows I've considered delays because we have worked together on delays. And again, it's rather like Kurt's problem there, that once we start considering delays, we have to be, and particularly if they're unknown delays. So you know, I mean, if it's a known delay, it's obviously easier than if it's an unknown and varying type of delay, in which we have also worked. Then we broadly have to, if you like, loosen those bounds again. But to me, you know, again, there are delays in the real world, and again, that is something that we can expect. And so, hello to Amelia, and I miss working with her on the delay problem. We haven't had time recently, but we have some very nice papers in that area.
Thanks, Sarah. I would have a more sort of, I don't know if it's philosophical, but you were saying that in practice these these control laws that are discontinuous and could be infinitely discontinuous in theory, in practice will smooth them and filter them, and they'll become somehow continuous. And then you explain that they're not really continuous, right? They're
No, the control law is always discontinuous, but it's not infinitely. But it is the effect of that. So it isn't that we ever don't apply the discontinuous control signal in that particular paradigm that you're describing. So in order to reconstruct the equivalent control, it's on average what that discontinuous signal is doing. But in that case, we need the discontinuous signal in order to do it. Now, sometimes we smooth the corners of the discontinuous signal, which is, you know, effectively gives us, if you like, a smooth switch. So it's not a pure discontinuity. We sort of smooth the air. But effectively, the argument about the equivalent injection still largely goes through, again, to a practical abstraction, shall we say.
right. And what I was thinking is then you use also the discontinuity to model natural behaviors from existing nature. But again, we're sort of making an approximation. Maybe it's more continuous than we're modeling.
Yeah, and it is, yes, and often so that's why I like that particular paper from the immunology survey, because it does have a discontinuity. But sometimes they don't have a discontinuity. They effectively do what we do in reality to smooth the discontinuity, because we notice for many real systems, you know, electromechanical systems, for example, we certainly wouldn't be wanting to have that discontinuity. And maybe nature doesn't want to have that discontinuity either. And so when you do look at a lot of the biological models, they effectively use exactly the same fundamental formulation that we use in smoothing the discontinuity. So definitely that happens. It depends what particular literature you read. So whether it's a switch or whether it's what we'd implement as a good control engineer, a smooth switch that evolution has taught, but it can still be interpreted, I believe, as a switch, you know, because it gives us those benefits in terms of robustness and indeed performance.
Thank you, Sarah. Still have one question in the chat, maybe one in the room as well. No? Well, I'll read the last one from Dimitros Papageorgiou. Can we relate the tuning of the sliding mode control with prescribed accuracy? So, given output error bounds, can we tune the sliding mode control?
It's not my preferred approach. You do see some papers in the literature that they talk about breaking the sliding motion, and they use it to assess, for example, when a fault has happened. So they say, you know, oh well, if I've tuned it out of this particular band, then it's no longer a sliding mode. I mean, for me, the big problem with doing that is the mathematical machinery that we use a lot of the time is quite conservative. And so to actually use that as a kind of way to do design or analysis, I don't do it myself. Because I think it leads to misleading results, because I think the conservativeness of the theory makes what you do as an outcome of doing that less ideal than if you actually look at the equivalent injection itself and make explicit judgments about the uncertainty, and perhaps allow yourself to be a bit conservative in the switch. So I never, if I've got enough control energy, I never think of breaking a sliding mode. I would keep the sliding mode and analyze what that gives me, rather than trying to tune it so heavily and closely that I risk breaking it, because then I lose that machinery of the equivalent injection.
Thank you. And a last question, sorry, and it will be last answer, from Hu Tin Do. Do we have some conditions or criteria to help us to decide if we should choose variable structure control over other methods? And we're a bit back to the Frank's question,
Yep.
I guess.
Yeah, I think it's difficult because again, as I've said, I believe in a diversity of thoughts and approaches. I do think if you have problems that are nonlinear and very uncertain, it's a good approach. I think, if you have a lot of knowledge about your system, and if your system is not very uncertain. So, for example, you sometimes see papers where people have a fully known nonlinear system and they apply a sliding mode control. And I'm never so sure of the value of that. But if something is nonlinear and it's highly uncertain, so in some of these biological things, as we've said, there can be several orders of magnitude in the parameters. It's not like the 10 to 15% of a typical DC motor data sheet, for example. Then I think it's a good bet.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the audience, and thank you all the ones that were online. We're closing the session, so an applause to Sarah again.